Hello everybody and welcome to Pint of Science. We're coming live to you from the city of Lincoln. My name's Kay Ritchie and I'm a senior lecturer in the psychology department at the University of Lincoln. I'm also the city coordinator for Pint of Science and I'll be acting as our host this evening. So there's going to be lots of opportunities for you to get in touch with us, for you to comment and for you to ask questions of our speakers. And the way you do that is type in your comment either underneath the YouTube video or beside it, however it appears for you. And we can bring your comment up on the screen and see what you're saying and ask your questions to our speakers. So for the first thing that I'd like to ask you is, where are you joining us from and what are you drinking this evening? So while you're answering that, I'll tell you how our show is going to go tonight. We've got two fantastic speakers, both from the School of Psychology at the University of Lincoln. And in fact, our backstage producer, Tessa Flack, is also from the School of Psychology. So today is Psychology Takeover Day in Lincoln, which I'm very pleased about. So we'll have our first speaker's talk, and then you can ask her questions. Then we're going to chat a little bit about our creative reactions work, which is our artworks inspired by scientists and the science of Pint of Science. All of those artworks this year from Lincoln have been made by our fine art students, so we're very pleased about that. Then we'll hear from our second speaker and you can ask her questions, and we'll make sure that we finish in enough time for you to get another drink and a comfort break in case you're going to one of the other Pint of Science shows tonight. So first of all, I'd like to say a massive thank you to Tessa Flack, who's going to run things behind the scenes and act as our producer today. And now I'd like to know where you're joining us from and if you've told us what it is that you're drinking. Mizzy's joining us from Portugal. Wow, that's much farther away than I thought we would get anyone joining us from. Welcome. Oh, and Maria from Brazil, that's even farther away. Welcome. Yorkshire, Andrew's joining us from Yorkshire. That's less far away, but just as exciting. Have you had thunder? We've had thunder. And Paul is in a sunny, rainy, stormy Driffield. Yep, that sounds a bit like what Lincoln's been like today. Bella, hello from Birmingham. Hello, Birmingham. Coming to you live from Lincoln. It sounds like the Eurovision, doesn't it? And Gloucestershire with a cup of tea. Fantastic, Valerie. Enjoy your cup of tea. So remember that you can ask questions of our speakers at any point during their talks just by typing your questions in underneath the YouTube video, and we can bring those up on the screen. You can also keep in touch with Pint of Science on social media. We're at Pint of Science, and the hashtag is #Pint21. Okay, so without much further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, who's my colleague and friend, Dr. Julia Foecker. Hello, Julia, how are you?
Hi, Kay. I'm very fine. Nice to see you.
It's good to see you too. Is that a brain you have on your windowsill behind you?
Yes, actually it's a brain. It's a very big brain. I'm showing that to you, so it's here.
Excellent. That is, yes, rather larger than life-sized, I'd hope, but fantastic. Well, that feeds in really well to what you're going to speak to us about today. So I'm really looking forward to hearing which of my favourite video games is going to be the best at training my brain or improving my cognitive skills. So over to you, Julia.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kay, for the very nice introduction, and also thank you so much, Tessa and Kay, for organizing this great event. Today I will talk about action video games in the spotlight, and I would like to share with you a neuroscientific approach. So over the past 20 years, there has been a significant scientific interest in investigating the behavioral consequences of playing video games. And the articles which I'm here posting on the slide focus on one type of video games, which are the so-called action video games. In an action video game, the action video game player has to control the avatar of a protagonist who has to perform different tasks, for instance, collecting objects, avoiding obstacles, or batting enemies. And usually this action video game player has to make speedy decisions in order to reach the next level of the game. And the question is now, which researchers have asked, how is attention improved by action video games? And in order to understand this question, this research has focused on different types of attention. So one is the focus on objects, on space, and on time. And I would like to guide you today through the visual spatial selective attention. So one specific paradigm which has been used in order to understand the spatial attention in video game players is the so-called useful field of view task. And in this task, this little triangle is presented on a spoke with a specific type of eccentricity, and the participants have to indicate the spoke on which this triangle is presented. So in this case, it's spoke number 6. So in order now to understand the causal impact of video games on cognitive functions, we have to run training studies. And in these training studies, the non-video game players are invited to come to the lab. They are invited to do this pre-test on the useful field of view task, and then they are divided into 2 different types of group. One is the action video game group, which is trained 10 hours in the lab on Call of Duty, Medal of Honor, or Unreal Tournament. And this group is compared with a control group who plays Tetris, The Sims, or Restaurant Empire. And after this training, the participants are coming back for the post-test, and they do this on this useful field of view task again. So you can compare now the pre-test with the post-test performance in the action video game group and the control group. And I would like to show you now the results. So here on the x-axis, you can see the eccentricity with which this triangle has been presented. And on the y-axis, you can see the correct target detection performance. The green lines here indicate the pre-training performance, and you can see that the action video game group doesn't differ from the control group. However, after 10 hours of video game training, we can see that there is an improvement in the spatial distribution of attention, and it's much more enhanced after action video game training. So these results suggest that video game training can improve the ability to focus and divide attention. And other research has shown that there is an increased capacity to attend to multiple objects and a faster detection and recognition of relevant events. And given now this huge range of improvement after action video game, researchers have asked the question, so what are now the underlying mechanisms which may explain these enhanced attentional skills in video game players? And one hypothesis is that this is the so-called top-down attentional control. So top-down attentional control can be defined as our goal-directed attention, which allows us to select visual information in our environment based on our internal goals. So we argue now that action video game players have an improved top-down attentional control, which allows them to flexibly orient their attention to objects, to space, and to time. And the next question we were asking now, okay, how do these attentional networks change in video game players compared to non-video game players when we are looking at their brains? And in order to understand this, I will show you here a brain. This is here the frontal part of the brain, and this is the back part of the brain. And now I'm rotating this brain a bit, and in red, you can see here the so-called middle frontal gyrus. And this is one important area which belongs to our attentional network. Besides this area, there is this superior parietal lobe, which is also an important area in this attentional network. And together, this frontal and parietal area create the frontoparietal network. So now I'm showing you actually a schematic scheme of these top-down attentional control network, which you can see here. So these are the frontal areas. They send information to the parietal areas and to the visual areas. And we are asking now this question, so how does this top-down attentional control network change when task difficulty increases? And in order to understand this, we recruited action video game players based on self-report. So they reported a minimum of 5 hours per week of action video game play over the past year. And we compared them to the non-video game players, which only played 1 or less hours per week of action video games. So then we asked them to perform the following task. So we asked them the question, is there a diamond or a square in the target rings? And as you can see here in the low load condition, this task is very easy to perform. However, under the high load, very different shapes are presented, so it takes much longer time to answer this question. We are now interested in the network recruitment when we look at the high load versus the low load condition in gamers and non-video game players. And I will show you now the results. So here on the left side, you can see the non-video game players, and they recruit this typical frontal-parietal network, which I have shown you before. And on the right side, you can see the action video game players. And the action video game players show much reduced recruitment of this frontal-parietal network as compared to the non-video game players. So what does it mean, actually? So we argue now that this less recruitment of these frontal areas when task difficulty increases in gamers compared to non-video game players is due to a greater automaticity in gamers because they performed much faster on this task than non-video game players. And this greater automatization of processing often results in diminished cortical recruitment, which has been also shown in other tasks, for instance, perceptual learning and more executive levels. So when we go back now to this view here of the attentional networks, we can see that besides this top-down attentional control network, there's another network, and this is the so-called stimulus-driven control network. And this network is very important when we need to reorient our attention or ignore distractors. And we were asking now in our next experiment how these two networks interact with each other in gamers compared to non-video game playing peers. So we presented our gamers and non-video game players this cueing paradigm in which an auditory cue indicates the location of this visual Gabor patch, which you can see here. And the participants had to respond to the orientation of this patch as fast and as correct as possible. And in very rare trials, we presented two noise patches, and in this case, the participants had to withhold their response. So what we can see now when action video game players and non-video game players perform this task, that the action video game players make less false alarms compared to non-video game players. And at the same time, when we look at the brain networks, we can see that the higher the activation in the medial frontal gyrus, the parietal cortex, and the temporal parietal junction, the lower the errors in the gamers, but not in the non-video game players. So this suggests actually that there might be a neural correlate of enhanced suppression in gamers compared to non-video game players. And we argue that this is related due to a dynamic reconfiguration of this top-down and stimulus-driven control network in video game players. So the next question we were asking is whether we can find neural signatures of video game players being faster in the processing of visual information. So basically we were asking the question, when does this top-down attentional control or goal-directed attention impact our visual processing? And we were running here an EEG experiment in which we could measure the time course of neural activity, and we again presented a spatial cueing paradigm in which the participants orient their attention either to the left or to the right side of the screen, and they had to detect as fast and as correct as possible these rare oriented target Gabor patches. What we can see is, again, that the gamers are faster, especially in the focused attention condition, compared to the non-video game players. And interesting is that when we record the event-related potential or the brain signal to this focused attention condition, we can see an enhanced modulation at around already 100 milliseconds in the gamers, but not in the non-video game players. So this suggests actually that there is an earlier attentional modulation in gamers compared to non-video game players, and we call this the anterior N1, and this may reflect actually their superiority at efficiently focusing their attentional spotlight on relevant information. So to summarize now the main findings of a neuroscientific approach in video gaming, what we can see is that there seems to be evidence for a higher automaticity, so a reduced recruitment in this top-down attentional control network when task difficulty increases. We also see that there is an enhanced suppression of irrelevant information, and this is especially indicated in this right temporal parietal junction. And we also can see that there is a more efficient focus of the attentional spotlight in gamers compared to non-video game players, which is shown in the anterior N1. So I would like to thank a lot all my collaborators, especially Daphne Babelier. I would like to thank a lot all the organizers, and I would like to thank you a lot for your attention.
That's absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Julia. And I think you answered my initial question at the beginning there, which is which of my video games are going to be better for me? And I was specifically thinking of Call of Duty and a cooking game. So I think you've answered that those exact things being the ones that you use in your tasks. I can see we have a couple of comments in the chat, but I'm going to just hog the limelight for a second longer and ask you the first question, if that's okay. So everybody, if you do have questions for Julia, please type them in underneath the YouTube video. So I'm thinking there's clear benefits to playing action video games in terms of attention and the different things that you've shown us. What about people who don't want to play action video games? Are there other tasks in the world that they might be doing or could do more of that would see similar benefits as playing action video games?
Yes, so other findings show that there's also an improvement in spatial cognition, for instance, or in visual perception. So this kind of improvement has been also shown in other types of experiments.
Okay, so if I was to do something that engaged my peripheral spatial attention, like maybe, say, sight reading music, where you sort of have to pay attention to what's coming up next, could I anticipate seeing some benefits that might be a little like action video game playing?
It could be possible, but this has to be, of course, further investigated. Yeah, but
that's our next project then, Julia.
Exactly. That would be a very interesting project next, yes.
So have we got some questions from some of our viewers? Fantastic. Andrew has asked, do you have any comments on the feasibility of using your results to design methods through which learners with SEND, so I think that's special educational needs and disabilities issues, can be helped to overcome their challenges?
That's a very interesting and important question. Of course, these results are more focusing on adult action video game players. And we cannot now from these results draw direct conclusions on educational games, but there is also research on how we can use educational games and improve, for instance, other skills in learning, mathematics, etc. So this is also investigated.
Brilliant. And Andrea is asking, how long did the effect of the training last?
So there are specific types of video game training. So one has been run on visual perception, and this long-term effects have been also shown after 1 year, for instance. So this could be shown in visual perception, actually, yes.
Wow, that's much longer than I thought you were going to say. Have you looked at any of the longitudinal effects, Julia?
Myself, I haven't done any longitudinal studies.
Okay, fantastic. Another thing for the list then.
Exactly, yes.
Roger is asking, in what other tasks in life would action video game players gain an advantage because of these brain changes?
That's also a very interesting and important question. We have seen actually advantages by training, for instance, individuals with low vision. We have also seen that there is a performance gain in spatial cognition. There are studies also which indicates if you train, for instance, children on raving rabbits, a type of action video games, one can improve dyslexia and reading skills. So there is now a lot of effects which are reported basically, and these transfer effects which have been presented in the literature.
Okay, that's really interesting. I think we probably have time for one more question. Brilliant. So Bella's asking, is this likely to aid or hinder the concentration in ADHD? So that's attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder.
That's a very good and important question. So there has to be much more research done in order to answer this question, but there are some video games which have been prescribed also for children with ADHD, for instance, in the US.
Okay, fantastic. That's really interesting stuff, Julia. Thank you very much. So what I'd like to do next, as a little break in between our two talks, is just talk about our new endeavour this year that we've added to our Pint of Science offering at Lincoln, which is creative reactions. So Creative Reactions is the Pint of Science initiative that links up scientists with artists to create some pieces of art which are inspired by the science of our Pint of Science speakers. And Julia has been involved in that this year. So can you tell us, Julia, who it is that you've worked with and what they've created?
Yeah, I have worked with Katie Watson, and this was a really very great experience. So thank you again, Kay, also for this opportunity. So we created, or Katie created, a video game landscape with a character selection on the screen, where you basically can choose your avatar. And depending on your level of expertise, you can choose a typical video game player by looking into the video game player's brain and choose this avatar, and then you reach basically an advanced level. Or you can choose a non-video game player and you look at the non-video game player's brain again, and then you are transferred to the beginner's mode.
Ha, that's absolutely brilliant. Yeah, very clever stuff. So we can see Katie's artwork and all of the other works that have been created by our Lincoln Fine Art students at the website creativereactions.blogs.lincoln.ac.uk. So do go over there to have a look at those if you're interested. I can promise you it's a treat. So Julia, how did you find the process of working with an artist? Is this something that you've done before, or was it totally new to you?
So it was totally new to me, but it was really a very exciting experience, because it was very nice to see this explaining the research to Katie, and then Katie transformed that in her own ideas and thoughts in this artwork. And this development was really very exciting, and I would summarize it as a very great metamorphosis.
Brilliant. So has the process of actually working with Katie during this event made you look any differently at your own research area?
Yeah, I think it opens actually the perspective for interdisciplinary work. For instance, also the artwork behind video games, also how you communicate your research to, for instance, other people. And it's also really great to see this kind of creativity in the artwork, which of course also for us as in research is already always very important to have, right? So this creativity in research questions, etc. So this was really a very great experience.
Brilliant. I'm really glad you've enjoyed it. Your enthusiasm for it's really coming across, Julia, which is excellent. So the last thing I'd like to ask you is, what do you hope that people will get out of seeing your research interpreted through art?
Yeah, I would like to communicate actually different perspectives on the topic of video games. So, for instance, that there are also positive aspects in video game play, and that we can use this kind of positive aspects to create or transform that in technologies which are important for education, for rehabilitation and learning.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's great. So I'd just like to take a second to highlight a couple of the other artists who've been involved in Creative Reactions with us this year. Some of you may have caught our Pint of Science show in 2020. Our speaker then was Roger Bretherton from the School of Psychology, represent psychology. And Roger's research is onto character strengths. And he's been working with an artist called Abigail Kettle, who's created a piece entitled Slowly the Seeds of Strength Grow. And I think it really does capture the essence of Roger's work. So it's a video piece featuring mod rock sculptures with dried flowers. And there's also a spoken word poem. So you can find that on our Creative Reactions website. And Ed Roberts, who works under the name Lime Green Welly, is another one of our Lincoln Fine Art students. And he's been working with Neil Holden, who actually gave a talk in our very first year of Pint of Science before everything was online. Remember when we could go to pubs and listen to science talks? Neil was involved in that, and Ed's created a piece inspired by Neil's work on asthma and different respiratory diseases. It's called A Bubble of Air, and it's mixed media sculptures of glass bubbles with fragments of inhalers, and there's also accompanying audio pieces with those. So I'd definitely urge you to go to our website, which is creativereactions.blogs.lincoln.ac.uk, to see the work of 7 of our different fine art students from Lincoln. So thank you very much for being part of that, Julia, and I'm so glad that you've enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Excellent. You're being too kind, Julia, but I'll take it. So I'd like to just introduce our second speaker now, who's my other colleague and friend, Petra Pollux. So welcome, Petra.
Hi, Kate.
So we'll say goodbye to you just now, Julia, but thank you very much for joining us. It's just nice to have a little psychology party on screen all together.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Petra is going to speak to us about the cognitive daisy, which is, well, she'll tell you about it, but something that she's designed in conjunction with our other colleague, John Hudson. So I'm really looking forward to hearing all about this, Petra. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Kay. And thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Tessa, and the audience for listening to this talk about the cognitive daisy. John and I have been working quite a long time together, and we started developing the cognitive daisy in around 2014. And we will talk about this in this talk. So before I start to talk about the cognitive daisy itself and what it is, I just want to provide a bit of background and the challenge that I think the cognitive daisy is responding to. So as you are all aware, our population is aging, and with that, dementia is increasing in our society. The cognitive problems associated with dementia vary quite a bit from person to person, and that is influenced by things like stage of disease, the type of disease, but a lot of other factors that can influence this. So two people with the diagnosis of dementia, one person might have memory problems, some attentional problems, whereas another person with the same diagnosis might have very specific problems. So, for example, they might have difficulty recognizing faces, or they might perceive objects quite differently than we perceive them. So the cognitive problems associated with dementia are quite unique from person to person. So to provide optimal person-centered care or individualized care or care that is tuned into the individual needs of a person, it is important to consider these unique cognitive profiles. And this is where the challenge lies, because we've done quite a bit of research in care homes. And in that context, it is a challenge for care staff, because that information about the unique problems of each person with dementia is often not available. Sometimes people have just a diagnosis, or there's no information, or it's out of date. But even if that information was available, which sometimes it is, sometimes there is some information about cognitive screening, it would be a real challenge for care staff to remember all these unique cognitive cognitive profiles. For example, for all residents in one care home, with the turnover of staff that exists in those homes often. So this is why we think the cognitive daisy could be very useful in these particular situations. So the cognitive daisy is it's a representation or a visual depiction of a unique cognitive profile of a person in the shape of a colored flower. So there are 5 cognitive domains. There's perception or seeing, comprehension, communication, memory, and attention. And they're each associated with a different color. So each petal is then associated with a specific function within that domain. So, for example, a blue petal could be indicative of a spatial awareness problem, or face recognition problem, or an object recognition problem. And all these individual functions are assessed with the cognitive daisy assessment battery. And this battery we developed, it is an adaptation, or it's adapted from standard neuropsychological tests, but we've adapted them to accommodate people of older age. Now, how it works is that if there is a colored petal, that indicates that a person might have problems with this particular function in daily life, whereas a white petal indicates that they're not likely to have problems with. Now, an important point that I need to mention is that this is not a diagnostic tool. So it assesses whether a person has the ability or the capacity to perform that task, but it doesn't tell you anything about how good they are at it, how fast they are at it. So, for example, a person might have been able to write beautiful prose in the past. At the point of assessment, they might be able to write a few words. That doesn't mean that they're ability to write is still the same, but they're still able to write. And that means that they will get a white petal. The aim of the cognitive DAISY is to support care. So it's not a diagnostic tool. The idea is that the DAISY is on display, and that when care staff views the cognitive DAISY, they can make an interpretation of the DAISY and then immediately adjust their in-the-moment care decision. So they don't have to rely on the care plan, they don't have to ask anybody, they just look at the DAISY and then think about how they could possibly approach the person differently or communicate with them differently. The DAISY can also be very useful to monitor fluctuations. So once an assessment has been completed, then in observations, for example, in daily care, you might notice that they might become worse at person recognition or better. So there might be some change, and that might be because of just normal fluctuations, but it might also be an indication of improvements or further decline. So we generally recommend that these assessments, a full assessment, is repeated every 6 months. But if there is some indication in observation that a reassessment might be necessary, then a particular function could be assessed, or a particular domain could be reassessed, or the whole DAISY could be assessed. I should also mention that it should obviously be considered in combination with all the other information that is available about the person, the observations, life story booklets, etc. So these are some examples of cognitive DAISYs. As I mentioned, we've done some research in care homes in Lincolnshire, and we've done quite a few assessments. And these are real DAISYs, obviously not the right names. But you can see, for example, these are all people with dementia, and all the DAISYs are very different. So, and in fact, of all the people who we have assessed, we never had an identical or two identical DAISYs. So, for example, the person at the right top, this person has severe problems with memory, moderate problems with attending, with concentration, concentrating on a conversation, for example, but they don't seem to have any problems with communicating or comprehension or with any perceptual skills. Whereas the person in the middle has a problem in all tasks, except one crucial one, and that is the white petal, and that indicates that the person is able to understand verbal instructions. And that was actually quite a revelation for the care staff when they found this out, and it had quite an impact in how they communicated with the person, how they got the person involved in decision making. The Cognitive DAISY tool comes with a petal by petal guide, and that gives you a bit more information about each petal. So this is an example of the first blue petal, spatial awareness. It describes, first of all, what it is, or how it is, how it affects a person's life. And then on the left side of the right side of the screen, there is a list of behaviors or of problems that the person might experience in daily life. So if a person has a reduced awareness of space on the left side of the world, for example, is not really aware of the left side of the world, then they might have problems with bumping into frames of furniture, have trouble crossing roads, not eat all the food on the plate. And on the right side, there are some suggestions for how care staff or carers could consider to help the person. So, for example, they could encourage for the person to look to the left, but that doesn't always help. You could try rotating the plate. You could lay out clothes. There's just a few recommendations, and they obviously have to be tailored to the person and the context of the person. But what is also important is that by reading the problems and associated possible solutions, it also helps care staff to think of their own solutions. It makes them within the context that they work. So how does it work in practice? So, for example, in care homes, because that's where we work most, first of all, the care home manager signs a license. Then you have basic training for all staff. And that training is It just teaches, it's basically what I've just been telling you now in the first few slides. It explains to you how to read the daisies, and then a little bit more about how they can use the information in the daisies in practice. And it can be online or it can be face-to-face. It depends on the preference. And then we have advanced training. Generally, that's conducted by a few senior members of staff, and they are then trained on how to conduct the cognitive DAISY assessments. Once the training is finished, then all the residents can be assessed, or if it has already been in place for a while in a care home, then the cognitive DAISY assessment can become part of the intake conversation. But once the assessment has been completed, the daisy itself, without any labels or any names or anything, it's just a colorful flower. It can then go into a location where it is useful. So, for instance, a resident's room in the morning when they are preparing for the day, the carer can look at the daisy and then take that information to think about solutions for how to best help the person in that moment. And then the detailed daisy with all the labels on it and all the recommendations in there that are generated by the petal by petal guide, that can then be included in the care plan. So at a higher level, we think that there will be transfer of knowledge. So just talking about cognition, about cognitive functions, and how it is associated with behavior, we think that it will really increase general knowledge about cognition and the importance of it in understanding the individual needs of a person. So a little bit about the research. We've done a lot of research. I've only taken a few things that were quite important for the further development of the cognitive DAISY. Once we developed it, the first people we asked were the public. Is this at all useful? Do you think it will be useful? And family carers of people with dementia confirmed that it was. They thought it could be very useful, and they helped us think about different care situations where it might be useful. We also did small trials with the Alzheimer's Society in Lincoln and also with the Derby NHS Trust. And we trained them to become assessors. So it's just a 3-hour session. We trained them how to become assessors, and then they went and used it in wherever they used it in the community to do some assessments. And then we asked feedback what they thought of it. And the first important point was that they thought the advanced training prepared them well to conduct the cognitive DAISY assessments in the community. And what was also very nice was that particularly in the experience of the Alzheimer's Society support workers, they mentioned that the daisies were very useful for discussing not just the cognitive problems, but also the cognitive strengths, the white petals in the daisy, for thinking about what you want to keep on doing, the things that you really like doing, and how you can use your cognitive strengths to achieve that. The last group were care home staff. As I mentioned, this study is published. You can read that. It's on the website. They mentioned that the basic training was very useful. It was engaging. I taught them a lot about cognition in general, but they learned also a lot about their own residents by looking at the daisies. And they also thought it was very useful for person-centered care. So what are we planning to do next? I think we've established that it is perceived as useful in many different contexts, and now we need to evidence this, that it is useful, that it's actually benefiting people, and that you can talk about this, people can tell you this, but you also actually need to have the documentation, the evidence for it, the numbers, and we hope to be able to do that in a larger scale care home study, where we also take some measures from residents, their quality of life ratings, their independence in daily care and daily living. And for care staff, we would like to find out whether it increases their confidence in care, whether it increases their knowledge about cognition. So that is what we hope to do next. We also want to find out more about how the cognitive DAISY could benefit patients and clients in community care. And we are now thinking about studies how we could best evidence this. We also continue to work on wide access. This is kind of like the first version in English, but we know that there are people living, about 4% people living in residents living in care homes speak English as their second language, and so we are thinking about a translation and other forms, versions of the Cognitive Daisy to widen access to as wide a public as possible. And I think that this is the last slide. We have a website with a little video explaining it again, and also some more information about the Cognitive Daisy itself. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you so much. It's brilliant to find out even more about this project, and I think the petal by petal guide is absolutely fascinating. Yeah, so we've posted that link in the chat as well. You can find out more about the Cognitive Daisy at cognitivedaisy.co.uk. And we've got time for a few questions, but as usual, I would like to ask one if that's okay.
Go on then.
You mentioned that one of the sort of unexpected takeaways was that care home staff were maybe looking at the strengths of their, so that the unfilled in petals of their patients, and maybe thinking about things a bit differently. I know that you've worked with quite a few students through the development of Cognitive Daisy. Have you found that sort of couching things in this way of things that could be missing or things that could be present, do you find that it maybe changes students' perceptions of people with dementia?
Oh, it certainly does. My colleague John Hudson has done several studies with students looking at attitudes towards dementia, knowledge about dementia, and I've done small trials also myself with my students, and you do see that attitudes towards dementia definitely changes just by doing the online training, just half an hour training, going through the slides, and it yes, it definitely works. Yes, so that's
brilliant. That's great. Good. I hoped so. So that's good to hear
yes.
that it does change people's opinions. Okay, we've got time for a couple of questions and comments. So Roger's asked, are there different kinds of dementia associated with different DAISY profiles?
You see, this is exactly what we don't want. So it is. I understand what you say, and I think that it is likely that there are certain problems that are more likely to be with vascular dementia, for example, than with Alzheimer's disease. But from the DAISYs itself, you can't really make any conclusions, even if the profile is a little bit more in line with one. It could also be due to another cognitive problem. And so it's not just in dementia. It could be useful in a wide range of neurological problems. So, for example, Parkinson's disease or stroke, or it's everybody who has cognitive problems might have could benefit from using the DAISYs. So I would be very hesitant to use the Cognitive Daisy to dissociate, because some of the unique profiles might be the same for, or very similar for, people with one neurological problem than another.
Yeah, okay.
You see what I mean? So it's definitely not wanting to use it as a dog. But thank you very much, Roger, for your interesting question. And we always try to hammer this home, that it's not a diagnostic tool.
Message received. Rhiannon's asked, actually, that leads really nicely on to Rhiannon's question. Has the Cognitive Daisy been applied to other cognitive conditions? And she agrees with me that the petal by petal guide is really interesting.
Thank you. Yes, it can be used for everybody. I have been speaking mostly about dementia, but it can be useful for everybody who has cognitive problems, because it just highlights the cognitive strength and the cognitive weaknesses, independent on what the underlying diagnosis or neurological problem is. So yes, yes.
Yes,
It could be, but we haven't. We have spoken, or we have submitted a grant proposal in the past to explore the usefulness of the cognitive DAISY for people with Parkinson's disease, but unfortunately it was not effective. But we have spoken with people. We have a PPI team, which is a public involvement team of people with Parkinson's disease, and they really see the benefit of it.
Brilliant. So that sounds like, again, another strand of research to put in the later. Fantastic. Okay, I think we'll make this our last comment. So Valerie has said this will be so useful for agency staff who are in and out of different care homes, exactly, to be able to come in and just see a snapshot of each patient.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we would really like to try, but it's probably going to be a really big study because we think it could be particularly useful for communicating between different health professionals. So, for example, if a person from a residential care home has to go into hospital, if the hospital is also aware of the cognitive DAISY, then they just have to look and then adjust their care approach immediately in response to the DAISY.
Yeah, that's absolutely brilliant. I think we can all see the impact of this. So good luck with rolling it out into more care homes and different settings.
Thank you
so much for sharing your research with us, Petra.
It's my pleasure.
We'll say bye-bye to you just now then. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So just to finish up then, that's all from us for today. There are lots of other Pint of Science shows that you can engage with going on throughout this week, and you can find details of those at pintofscience.co.uk. We have our final show coming to you from Lincoln on Thursday at 6 p.m, and that's about health and society and health and social care. And that will feature two of our colleagues from our health and social care department at the University of Aberdeen, of the University of Lincoln. That'll get me sacked. There is a feedback form underneath the description of today's event. If you look underneath the description on YouTube, there's a feedback form. If you wouldn't mind filling that in, that would be really, really useful to us. And if you fill it in before the end of June, you can be in with a chance of winning a prize. So please do fill that in. Okay, well, that's all from us in Lincoln for today. Bye-bye.